Good morning and welcome to the 23rd meeting of the Local Government and Communities Committee in 2019. And can I remind everyone present to turn off their mobile phones. The agenda item 1, the committee is invited to consider and agree whether to take agenda item 5 in private. Item 5 is consideration of evidence heard today in relation to the committee's pre-budget scrutiny. Are we all agreed? Yeah. Thank you. That is agreed. Agenda item 2 is consideration of the Tenancy Deposit Scheme Scotland Amendment Regulations 2019 draft, which makes minor improvements to the operation of tenancy deposit schemes to address new legislation, payment by instalments and best practice. The committee will take evidence on the instrument today, and I welcome Kevin Stewart, Minister for Local Government, Housing and Planning, and Charlotte Mahaffey, Head of Private Rented Sector Policy, Scottish Government. This instrument is laid under affirmative procedure, which means the Parliament must approve it before the provisions can come into force. Following this evidence session, the committee will be invited at the next agenda item to consider the motion to approve the instrument. I now invite the Minister to make a short opening statement.
Good morning, Convener, and I'm pleased to present the Tenancy Deposit Scheme Scotland Amendment Regulations 2019 for the committee's scrutiny. If approved, they will strengthen the principal regulations, the Tenancy Deposit Scheme Scotland Regulations 2011, and ensure that the tenancy deposit schemes continue to work within a robust operating framework. The original objectives for bringing forward tenancy deposit regulations and approved tenancy deposit schemes were to reduce the number of unfairly withheld tenancy deposits, to ensure that deposits are safeguarded throughout the duration of the tenancy, and that deposits are returned quickly and fairly to the tenant or landlord, particularly where there is a dispute over the return of the deposit. Our tenancy deposit regime was established by the Housing Scotland Act 2006, which requires ministers to approve schemes before they can protect deposits. 3 tenancy deposit schemes were approved by ministers in Scotland in 2012. The 2006 Act also obliges ministers to review each scheme from time to time and gives them the power, once they have done so, to ensure that any scheme is revised. When the schemes were approaching the end of the 5th year of operation, I asked my officials to conduct a review of the schemes and the operating framework and conditions for the protection of tenancy deposits. The review sought views independently from those tenants and landlords who have used the deposit scheme and from the schemes themselves. The results of my review were published in December 2018, and I'm pleased that it found that the principal regulations continued to provide a robust regulatory framework. As expected, the review also found that the regulations required minor updates, not least to keep abreast of our private rented sector reforms. The regulations before you today will make improvements to how the tenancy deposit schemes operate. These changes respond directly to the review and address best practice, increase efficiency and take account of new legislation. For example, by ensuring information about sanctions is provided by the schemes to the tenant where a landlord has not met the requirement to lodge the deposit within 30 working days, helping us to strengthen enforcement. By requiring the landlords to provide the tenant with certain information where the deposit is being paid in instalments. By expediting repayment of a protected deposit where the landlord does not wish to retain any part of it, and to ensure a landlord is not required to pay a deposit into the schemes where a private residential tenancy has been ended and the deposit repaid to the tenant prior to the date landlords must lodge the deposit. Not all of these improvements require legislation. It's to the credit of the approved schemes that, through lessons learned since initial start-up in 2012, they can evidence improved performance and internal changes. In compliance with the 2006 Act, I've asked the 3 tenancy deposit schemes to submit revised procedures to me to ensure they comply with the amended regulations. I hope to approve the revised schemes soon after the amendment regulations come into force. Thank you, Convener, and I'm happy to answer any questions on the instrument.
Thank you, Minister. Do you have any questions from members? Andy?
Thanks very much. Minister, I mean, would you say these regulations strengthen the interests of tenants more than landlords, or landlords more than tenants?
I think in all of this, these cases, there is a balance to be struck. I think that we have struck that balance. These regulations will ensure that there is fairness across the board.
It's just in the review that you conducted in Figure 14, as to whether tenants and landlords felt they were treated fairly at the end of the tenancy. Virtually all tenants felt that, but lots of landlords felt they weren't. I'm just wondering what was behind that.
There's always a balance to be struck. I did not do the analysis of the consultation, so I'll maybe pass over to Ms McHaffey, as of course it was her team that undertook the analysis of the consultation responses.
I think there's a challenge here around some of the evidence that's required when a POSIT goes into a dispute, and then that is why the schemes have an adjudication process that's there to try and resolve that dispute where it occurs. I think the difficulty there is where the landlord has not necessarily gathered sufficient evidence to demonstrate that the claim for that deposit is sufficient, and I think that is where some of that dissatisfaction with the outcome of that process lies.
So these regulations won't make much change to that?
They're not going to change the adjudication process. You know, I think that is there, and it's something that the schemes continue to look at, and how they can provide information to landlords at that earlier stage to say what it is they need to be doing when they set up the tenancy, in terms of the schedule of condition, the information that they have that can then demonstrate that damage has been caused by the tenant and they have a claim to the deposit.
Okay, thanks.
Right, thank you. Yeah.
Can you tell us how this regulation would speed up payment to a tenant where the landlord isn't wanting any money back?
Convener, again, there's a balance to be struck here in all of this in terms of getting this absolutely right. I think that the review that we have carried out shows in the main that this scheme is working well, and that's why there are only minor changes. I think there's been a fair amount of scrutiny of the scheme. Mr. Whiteman himself asked, if I remember rightly, 7 questions not so long ago about all of this. I think, as I say, in all of this, there is a balance to be struck. There is often, as we know from our constituency, casework, some dispute around about certain things. But on the whole, I think that the scheme works extremely well, and that there is that dispute resolution, as Ms McHaffey says, which, of course, tries to ensure that whoever is owed the money gets that as quickly as they possibly can. Do you want to add to that?
Yes, in terms of the actual regulations, in terms of speeding up the repayment to tenant, at the moment there's a requirement for the schemes to go back to the tenant where the landlord has said they don't want anything and get confirmation. That obviously increases delay, and actually there's no need where the landlord is willing to repay the whole amount to get that confirmation from the tenant themselves, so it can just be paid back, and this will allow that to happen.
Okay, so the answer was you don't have to go back to the tenant. You'll just pay them the money?
Yeah.
Okay, smashing.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? No. In that case, then, I'll move on to agenda item 3, which is a formal consideration of motion S5M 18218, calling for the Local Government and Communities Committee to recommend approval of the Draft Tenancy Deposit Schemes Scotland Amendment Regulations 2019. Minister, do you wish to speak on this?
I'll just formally move, Convener.
Thank you very much. Any contributions from the members? No? Do you wish to sum up?
No, I don't. Thank you, Convener.
The question therefore is that motion S5M 18218 in the name of the Minister for Local Government and Planning be approved. Are we all agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. That is agreed. The committee will report on the outcome of this instrument in due course. And I invite the committee to delegate authority to me as convener to approve a draft of the report for publication. Thank you. In that case, thank you very much, Minister. Thank you very much, Mr. We'll suspend briefly to allow the witnesses to change over. Before we go on to agenda item 4, can I just put on the record for the avoidance of doubt that earlier today I asked for agenda item 5 to be heard in private, but should have been agenda item 5 and 6. Are we agreed with agenda item 5 and 6 being heard in private? Thank you very much. Okay, the committee will now take further evidence from representatives from the Accounts Commission, COSLA, Solus Scotland and Directors of Finance in relation to its pre-budget scrutiny and the long-term financial sustainability of local government. The purpose of this and following sessions is to help inform a letter we will be writing to the Scottish Government later in the autumn, suggesting issues to prioritise in next year's budget. The committee also has a more general and long-term interest in the future of local government funding and finance. And I welcome today Graham Sharp, Chair of the Accounts Commission, Councillor Gail McGregor, Spokesperson for Resources, and Vicky Bibby, Head of Resources, COSLA. David Robertson, Chief Financial Officer, Scottish Borders Council, Solus Scotland, and Jim Boyle, Chair of CIPFA, Scottish Directors of Finance Section. I want to thank COSLA for the submission and also put in record thanks to all the councils who provided written submissions in response to our call for views. And I believe Councillor McGregor wishes to make a short opening statement.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, everyone. We very much welcome the invitation to the committee today to discuss the evidence submitted by COSLA in more detail. The evidence has been endorsed by Solus and also shares the fundamental messages of Directors of Finance and their section. In the committee's call for evidence, we particularly welcomed the recognition that the number of responsibilities placed on councils has increased, while we are being asked to do more with less. I am proud that independent bodies like Audit Scotland have praised the achievement of councils in this context, but I want to emphasise to the committee today this is not sustainable. Already we know that in 2020-21, councils will be expected to deliver almost £500 million of new commitments. Where these new commitments are not funded in full, in addition to existing local government budgets, the cost is more than financial. The cost is cuts to other service areas which support the vision and ambitions that we all have for Scotland. The reality is that we cannot achieve all that we or the Scottish Government aspire to achieve, including the National Performance Framework, without sufficient funding. This is compounded by the structure of the budget, with increasing ring fencing and national priorities often dictating and sometimes protecting as much as 61% of council budgets this year alone. This amplifies cuts in the remaining unprotected 39%. Services like economic development, libraries, employability, leisure and business support services all lie within this 39%, and the impact of cuts in these areas is very real to the individuals and the communities that we serve across Scotland. Councils face extremely difficult decisions in setting a balanced budget. I see the impact on individuals and communities in my own council, in my own local area, and I also see the impacts these cuts will have on long-term ambitions. COSLA has agreed 4 key priority areas for this year's spending review campaign, which include inclusive economic growth, well-being, tackling child poverty and tackling climate change. These are intrinsically linked, and our message is clear. Local government is uniquely placed to tackle these highly complex issues in a holistic way that best suits the needs of local communities. But we cannot do that without adequate and sustainable funding. There are difficult challenges facing us in the coming years, including unprecedented demographic change and uncertainties, obviously, around Brexit. Demand for council services increases at pace, and there is ever-increasing need to embrace emerging digital technologies. So in summary, to ensure sustainable communities across Scotland, local government's unique role in designing and delivering the vital services which underpin and provide the lifeblood to communities must be recognised and invested in. We have to move away from short-term funding, from siloed policy thinking, from national protections, which limit council choice and undermine local democratic accountability. We have to move away from input measures and reporting towards measured outcomes, and we must be open and transparent in the public narrative about the need for service redesign towards sustainable future services. I'm very happy to be here today, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Councillor McGregor. Sarah, do you want to kick off the questions?
Yeah, I thought that was a very useful introduction, and I think one of the things that you talked about was future demographic projections and the pressures that councils will face in the future. One of the things that comes through in terms of casework is that a lot of those pressures are already there. So we're already in that transition. Can you say a little bit more about both how you're dealing with those current issues, but how you do move on to deal with those issues, given that you're seeing reduced budgets?
Absolutely, yeah. I think a prime example is the health and social care sector, and obviously social care is a big issue in all of our communities. We're very aware that there's a 3.9% demand over the next 15 years for those services, which has a massive budgetary cost. And one of the pieces of work that we're doing with government at the moment and lobbying government for is a recognition that local councils deliver part of the health service. Although we're not part of the NHS, obviously, we're a very big contributor to health and well-being within our communities. So I think one of the key messages that we have is that with increasing demographic change, with increasing pressures, if local government can be more coordinated through our integrated joint boards, through our health and social care agendas, then we can begin to deliver better early intervention and better prevention measures, which will actually have a cost saving in the longer term. But if we don't address that now, we're going to have a ticking time bomb in 15 years' time and simply not be able to manage the pressures on that. But some of my colleagues might want to.
Just to add to what Councillor McGregor has said, I think some of the statistics, the projections by NRS in terms of the ageing elderly populations are quite stark. And if you look 21 years hence to 2040, the number of households with people over age 75 in them across Scotland is forecast to increase by 72%. And in some councils by significantly more than that. In one council, West Lothian Council, forecast to increase by 111%. But it's not just a long-term demographic problem. The similar statistics provided by the same body show that by 2023 across Scotland that forecast will be 17%. So you're right. The demographic challenge is with us now, and councils have been trying to respond to that as best as they can. They have more latterly been working jointly with our health colleagues as part of the integration joint boards and the health and social care partnerships. I think the work that has been done to eliminate duplication, to have more integrated care between the two sectors, is starting to gain a foothold, but it's still fairly early days yet of the integration joint boards. The whole raison d'etre for them being there is to achieve just those aims, to have a seamless health and social care service. I don't think we're quite there yet. I think there's a long way to go with it. And really the onus is on those partnerships to deliver more quickly, perhaps, than they have done thus far. I think part of the issue at the moment is that the acute sector is under extreme pressure, and that perhaps is taking away from some of the focus, some of the resources to be able to achieve that integration. So I think what we would like to see is the social care element of health and social care being seen more as part of the totality of health, and not health simply being the National Health Service. I think if we have that view on it, I think we do the integration joint board and their aims a bit of a disservice. So I think that's a key point that we would stress to the committee about seeing the totality of what health means, and not distinguishing between local government and NHS, perhaps, as much as we have done thus far.
That message comes through loud and clear in a lot of the submissions, in terms of practical things like adaptations, where you could do stuff short term and make an impact. So I'm very interested in how we pick that up. The other side of the preventative spend is tackling poverty reduction, which again is one of those issues that's currently going in the wrong direction. And I noticed that youth budgets are also under pressure. Are there messages you'd want to give to us about how we should be thinking about that in terms of the budget?
Again, the four priority areas that we've agreed, or leaders have agreed at COSLA, tie in with the four priority areas that government have had in their programme for government in their medium-term financial strategy. And I think it was really important to recognise across both local government and Scottish Government that these are massive priorities and we have to do them together. So, but they can't be done in isolation. So we have four key priority areas that are all intrinsically linked. So, for example, youth services, assisting younger people in the community. Councils have been really innovative with meals clubs and breakfast clubs to ensure that children are getting their meal a day. But along with that service, it then has to tie in with family link workers and wider social work, so that we're looking at the whole family and not just the child in isolation within the school. Now, to enable us to do that, we obviously have to continue doing what we're doing at the base. These are additional measures over and above, and they're interventions that are very serious to tackling child poverty, to tackling well-being. They all link across, because if you're helping the child and you're helping that family, you're then giving them a better opportunity in their life within their community. You're perhaps mobilising them into work, and it cuts across all of the areas of our priorities, but that can't be done without investment. And councils have been very quick to invest in that at this stage and look at the child element, but it has to be taken in its totality along with all of the other services that can assist a family in a community as well. So that's one example.
Listen, everybody doesn't need to answer every question, so only those that have got something new to offer would be better answering, or else we'll be stuck in here all day. Is there anybody else that feels it's important to come in on this one? David?
Just maybe make the point, Chair, that what councils would wish to see is a whole systems approach getting taken to the design and funding of health and social care services. And Councillor McGregor there mentioned mental health. The recent initiative around school counselling services has been very welcomed by councils. But if there's not then support mechanisms in terms of mental health through the National Health Service to support young people, that leads to many further problems down the line that we have to deal with across the public services. So we want to see that whole systems approach taken, health and social care managed as one, and a unified approach taken to funding.
Okay, thank you. Sarah?
And my third question is partly preventative, and it's partly looking to the future, is about how you're planning in terms of climate change. I've also got a potential issue about if we leave the EU. But I thought if I just focused on climate change, because we're debating that this afternoon, and it's likely that we're going to have a stronger target. There's both a mitigating the existing impacts of climate change, and then there's planning for the future. Presumably with the first two questions, which are about demographic change, there's huge pressure already. How are you picking up the new challenge of climate change, given you've got reductions in planning and transport budgets, pressures in waste management, and community heat networks are not currently there as a core issue? It's a massive agenda, so how are you balancing off the current challenges with that need to change services and provide new services in the future?
Summarised the challenges quite well there, actually. Jim, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, so there are a range of measures being undertaken by councils. So a number of councils are participating in the extension and of the vehicle charging network across Scotland and playing a very active part in that. My own council is. I know Dundee have certainly been very active in that, and that will hopefully stimulate the demand for electric vehicles and facilitate the expansion. There have been there will be many other measures in place in terms of how we manage our buildings, so the conversion from coal and gas-fired boilers among many of our buildings to biomass boilers, etc. There has been a number of smaller buildings-focused initiatives in place, but I mean, clearly the challenge needs to be faced in a whole systems way in terms of a support for the national strategy. And I know a number of councils are looking to have a carbon neutral approach. I think we're probably some way off from that in terms of being able to establish where each and every council is as regards carbon neutrality. I think the first step there would need to be an assessment of how far we are from it, what measures need to be put in place. Some measures are being put in place, but clearly the challenge is fairly significant. So, and a lot of these will require funding support from government level, and I know that has been provided. The vehicle charging network is substantially government funded, and councils providing some funding within that as well.
Just to pick up on that as well, I think it's really important to stress that within the 39% of essentially unprotected budgets, which is not ring-fenced or statutory, that's often where the jobs have sat that have been able to contribute towards climate adaptation, looking at sort of different economic and planning challenges within councils. Those jobs have sat within that 39%. And I think it's fair to say that historically, as we've been protecting budgets within education and social care, it's often been at the expense of the very people we're needing now to help us to deliver on that climate adaptation and climate change agenda. So I think we are going to have to invest at this stage to put in the capacity to ensure that we're able to meet that target. And I think that fairly we have taken people out of that area because it was sat within our unprotected budgets. But that will now need to be readdressed, so there will be a cost implication with that as well.
Thanks. And then you've got some other questions.
Yes, I'm going to ask you about IJBs, but before I do that, you, Mr. Boyle, mentioned electric vehicles and vehicle charging points. And I was speaking to a friend at the weekend who's got an electric vehicle and took the radical decision to travel to Skye from North Lanarkshire, a long way. And on the way, apparently there's an app you can use to find out where the vehicle charging points is. So I went to one, it was broken, went to another, it was broken. At this point, the juice is getting quite low. And this apparently is quite a regular thing. Now, I don't know the answer to this. I don't know who funds these, but apparently they're free to use. So, you know, it's not like having a petrol car where you have to pay to top it up. So is there an issue with funding there and maintaining these vehicle charging points? There certainly don't seem to be enough of them to get people to switch.
Yeah, so the network is is being expanded. The government certainly has plans to work in partnership with local government to expand that network and to provide, at the very least, a backbone of charging points up and down the country, but also further out into council areas. So it's clearly as the demand, the demand for vehicles will only for electric vehicles will only pick up pace if the network and the infrastructure is capable of supporting that. Yeah. So people will vote with their feet in the meantime. So there is clearly an onus on both levels of government to expand that network to a point where it's the confidence among the public to invest in that technology is there. So I would suggest we're at an early stage of providing that network, but clearly, again, there will be a significant capital cost implication of that, and some funding has been provided to get us to a point, but there is a massive expansion of that network required in years to come.
Is it councils that are responsible for installing the charging points?
There is significant central government intervention in providing capital funding to partly fund. The most recent one, certainly in my own council area, 70% capital funding was provided by central government, with the council providing the rest. And there are a number of bid schemes and bid funding pools available to councils to expand the network in their own area.
Who maintains them?
That would be the council.
The council maintains them?
Yeah.
So if they break down, it's the council's fault, I suppose.
Well,
responsibility.
It's the council's responsibility, but again, that's a further pressure on revenue budgets. But these funding bids would only be supported if there's a sustainable business case. They are lodged by councils, so there will be income generated from many of the charging projects through selling electricity to the grid, selling electricity to local businesses, etc. So there should be a sustainable business case before funding is awarded.
But if people aren't paying to charge their cars up, where's the ongoing funding for maintenance?
The funding would be from any other generation income sources that can be made through selling to the grid, selling to local businesses, etc.
Okay.
Did your phone get to Sky?
They got to Sky, yes. Eventually, yeah. Yes. They had to join a queue for the next charging point. So, anyway, we'll move on to IJBs, because a number of you have made submissions about that, including, well, the finance directors. I think that's you, Mr. Boyle. But a number of you basically said the same thing, that there are pressures there. There are funding pressures. And in the finance director's submission, you say there's significant financial stress in these partnerships. There's little evidence that resources and funding are moving to any great extent from acute healthcare to community health and social care. And it just struck me that, I mean, going back to what Councillor McGregor said at the start, that maybe people are still working a bit in silos, and that councils are perhaps the junior partner here. And I know, Mr. Sharp, you're doing a piece of work on this, but you've already done some, so you might want to come in as well.
I'll open up on that one. Yeah, so the integration joint boards have been there for 3-4 years now, so they are still in the early days of forming and moving forward what will be a medium and long-term agenda. So it's possibly unrealistic to expect the full extent of integration to have bedded in and been implemented by now. However, what we have seen up and down the country is an incidence of financial stress among a number of integration joint boards, quite a number of integration joint boards, which is causing some financial difficulties at the moment. Now, as I said, the reason for setting integration joint boards up in health and social care partnerships was to shift the balance of care from acute to community. Clearly that's not going to happen on day one, and clearly we would not expect the full extent of funding to be shifting from the acute sector to the community sector. And actually we should really stop talking about these separate sectors at some point, because that really just still encourages the division between acute and community. The reason for these financial difficulties at the moment, I'm sure there will be many reasons for it. Part of the reason is the desire, and I'm sure we would all share the desire to not have people sitting in hospital when actually they could be back out in a community setting, and the pressure to reduce the bed blocking and the delayed discharges as much as possible is something we would all support. However, it is placing pressure on the ability to provide that community provision within the partnerships. As I say, the acute sector is still facing severe financial pressure, so it's difficult to achieve the shift of funding from one sector to another, and therefore the care element of the partnerships is finding severe difficulty in being able to fund the provision of care, whether that be long-term care through care homes or care at home in the community, and there's a widespread incidence of pressures occurring there.
I think just further to that, obviously in last year's budget discussions we were discussing the ring fencing of funding around IJBs and health and social care councils, and I think one thing that we need to grasp going forward is a little bit more flexibility around some of the funding that sits within IJBs, that it isn't holding councils to a certain thing in their particular area. So I think that the 160 million of flexibility around ring fencing was useful because it meant that local councils could utilise it in a much more localised way. But it's just to stress that wasn't additional money. That was money that was already in the system. It just gave us a bit of flexibility around how we use it. But I think that discussion has to continue because obviously the pressures around ring fencing are very restrictive for councils, and that's where we find that perhaps some is moved more towards health than towards council. So I think that conversation needs to continue and was welcome last year, but it's just to stress it wasn't additional money in the system. It was just how we were able to use it.
Can I just clarify? Probably again, I think I might have had to clarify this last time. When you say ring fencing, you mean core services?
No, over and above core services.
Okay, such as?
Do you want to give some examples?
So what happened last year in the budget was there was new commitments to be funded, such as Frank's Law was one of those that was funding to the IJB, but the council wasn't allowed to reduce its budget contribution to the IJB over and above. So I think what we're seeing is money's going to local government for specific purposes like Frank's Law, ring-fenced, but on top of that you're effectively ring-fencing the whole of the social care budget because you're not, the commitment is you're not allowed to make any reductions in that sector. But so I suppose the question is use of ring-fencing, and I think this is blurring because there's ring-fencing in its traditional sense is there's a legality to the word ring-fencing. I think we're it's not ring-fenced in a legal sense through the budget, but it's ring-fenced in terms of a commitment. You will get this money if you deliver on X. So then, yeah, so what they're doing is they're giving you extra money to perform an extra function. Yes, but I'm not really sure where the issue is with that. Local government has absolutely no issue with getting money to perform additional function, but what we said again like last year, and this is what we're hoping won't happen this year, money's being given for an additional function over here, but money is coming away from the core budget over here, so the net effect is there's actually no increase. So what you're saying is you're not getting extra money to do that because they're taking out your budget? That's what it seems to be that you're saying. I don't really understand. Maybe it's just me, but I don't really understand what you're saying.
I think while money is being directed to specific policy initiatives to enhance services, what we're seeing is, as councils is the core is being eroded to support that additionality. So it's being eroded through the requirement to support these additional services, but it's also being eroded through real terms reductions in terms of the funding that we're getting to support the core. We're now going to come back to the whole funding issue where the government says 2.9 rise, you say something else entirely. And we can go round in a circle all day, right? I mean, funding is an issue for every level of government and every organisation
just about in the country. So we can spend a considerable amount of time on that, but I don't really think it gets us much further. The point I'm trying to make is that if you're getting extra money for something, I don't understand how that's a burden.
In the totality of the council budget, it isn't additional money. It's money that has been essentially put to the side for a specific purpose. But in the totality of the entire council budget, it's not additionality.
I know I'm going on about this, but what I don't understand... So what you're saying is that you would have had exactly the same money if you hadn't got the extra money for Frank's Law? I mean, that kind of seems to be what it is.
No.
Yes, you said, maybe you can come back to us with that, because I'm confused. You're saying you're getting extra money in one hand, but you're also saying that you're not getting extra money because it's coming out elsewhere. If I ask if it comes out of your budget, you say no. But anyway, let's move on. Sorry, Graham, you were still...
The point I'm trying to get at is, I mean, these boards, they're called integration joint boards, and they don't appear to be very integrated at the moment. It appears to me, and from the submissions that we've received and previous evidence sessions, that money is still being spent on acute services and perhaps less on things like adaptations, which Sarah Boyack mentioned earlier, which would ultimately help you save money in the long run. I mean, is that an accurate description?
If I may comment on IJBs, because the Accounts Commission has the responsibility for auditing IJBs, and IJBs have a duty of best value. And the way we've approached that up till now, because of the sort of nascent state of IJBs and the time it's taking them to sort of grow into the role that was set out for them, is to have across-the-board performance reports, which we've done jointly with the Auditor General, because it involves the health boards as well. And the second of 3 of those that we're doing came out at the end of last year, and I think that set out well the issues. And there are a number of issues, that there's a number of good things going on. The good things tend to be sort of relatively small-scale projects spread across the country, and some boards are doing much better than others in that respect. But there isn't yet any sort of large-scale major change in the sort of £8 to £9 billion of public money in terms of moving from acute care to preventative. And in our own overview report last year, we came back to IJBs and set out the 3 areas that you could look at as were causing particular issues, being governance, finance, and leadership. And I'd just like to comment on 2 of those. I think leadership, as we've said, is absolutely critical in IJBs to bring this together and push forward what essentially are transformation programmes. And one of the issues has been difficulty in building leadership. There's been very high turnover in senior management teams in IJBs, and clearly that's both a problem and perhaps it's also a symptom of another problem, in that perhaps people in those positions find it difficult to do the job they're trying to do because of the other issues. And there, I think, a turn to finance, because if you're looking at the sort of transformation programmes that are involved for this very significant move in resources from acute to preventative and have that work, it's a long-term project. And for that, you need to have medium and long-term financial planning, and that isn't really happening. And that goes back to, I think, the partners and the different budget constraints each partner works with, and they have different cultures and different reporting mechanisms, and that in some way needs to be unblocked and enable the IJB itself to be able to take more control of asset deployment and bring in the leadership to prepare proper plans for the future. And we see that happening more certainly than it was in the past. And in the next audit cycle, which will be in sort of 18 months or so time, we will move on to doing specific best value reports on IJBs as part of the annual audit. They won't be BV reports themselves, but in the annual audit we'll be looking at individual best value to reflect what we would expect to be an increase in them growing into the role. But there is a lot to be done, and I would highlight myself the financial structuring and getting into a position where IJBs are able to deal with their financing and they have a set-aside situation that's working, for example.
Yeah. I know you want to move on, Convener, but I just find this immensely frustrating and nobody seems to be doing anything about it. We've heard this time and time again as a committee, but you do have people working in silos. Nobody's taking responsibility for it. I'm not laying the blame at anyone's door, but somebody needs to get a grip here and sort this situation out so that they actually are properly integrated boards, not people just, frankly, looking after their own empires. I know you want to move on.
To be fair to Graham, the committee has shown a great deal of interest in IJBs, and we'll be looking at it again because some of the points that have been raised by all of you are recognised by us. Okay, Alexander.
Thank you, Convener. Councillor McGregor, at the beginning you gave a very good overview of where we are. You talked about doing more with less. You indicated that there are new commitments, there are new priorities, and that it was not sustainable going forward. Now, every council has looked at efficiency savings, and some councils have also looked at redesign. But within that redesign, there has been some difficulties about trying to manage to keep things going. And you talked about libraries or recreation or leisure being removed. So can I ask some specifics about it? So with efficiency savings, how has that helped to improve services delivery and mitigate from some of the challenges that you talked about earlier? So how have councils managed to do what you want them to do and what they are trying to achieve when they look at efficiency savings?
I think councils have been very good at reacting to ongoing budget savings over a long period of time. I think they've had to remodel in a number of areas over a long period of time as well. It's the sustainability going forward. I think we're reaching a stage now where we have developed services and cross council working. So we have the regional education collaboratives and we have better examples of cross-working. But I think the key thing at the moment is that we can no longer sustain what we're doing going forward and commit to the priorities within the National Performance Framework and commit to the additional national policies that are brought forward by government. So I think we're in a bit of a perfect storm that councils actually have done fairly well at continuing to do the day job, but it's with all the additionality on top that we will begin to struggle going forward. But I think what we are, again, very good at is being creative in our approach going forward. We're looking at digital transformation, and that will assist with some transformational change within councils, but a lot of that, again, needs investment. But I think fundamentally the key problem is that we're still working with one-year budgets, so we're working cap in hand year on year. If we were to have three-year budgets, greater fiscal certainty, we would be able to better forward plan. At the moment, in terms of both revenue and capital, it's very difficult to do long-term planning and true transformation and money saving in the longer term because we're only working 1 year to 1 year. But my colleagues will give more examples.
Okay, so just to expand on what Councillor McGregor has talked about, councils have been for a number of years getting balanced budgets. There is no council who has not balanced their budget in recent years, and it's been achieved through a combination of means. There's been a lot of what we've termed as efficiency, and quite often some of that efficiency has been not what I would describe as efficiency, but has really been pressing down on budgets as much as we can. So pressing down on inflationary provision, taking out areas which may impinge on service delivery. We produce an efficiency statement each year that is submitted to the government, and we've had discussion about this recently among directors of finance, and I think we feel that the time is now that we need to stop providing that statement, because it's potentially creating a false position of where councils' financial positions are. We have taken all the, and I hesitate to use the word easy efficiency measures. We have taken a whole range of budgets out over years. There has been some service reduction, there has been some service cessation, but not to a massive extent that the public would notice. There clearly have been reductions in service, and I don't wish to diminish the impact that has had on individual councils and communities. There has been a bit of service transformation, but I think the reality is that efficiency that was there has pretty much gone, and the ability of councils to balance budgets through efficiency measures in future years is extremely difficult, and I would suggest will not be possible through the means that we've been using in recent years. So I think the production of an efficiency statement has probably been to our detriment and has not created the right message, the right picture of the local government finances. And we talk among directors of finance on a regular basis. I have certainly detected a very common message across all councils, or most councils, that's the position that most of them are in now.
Alexander, Mr. Shamwas.
Sorry, I could comment from the Commission's point of view. I think in our reports, first of all, we've recognised the good work that councils have done in managing to maintain service levels with increasing demand and reducing resource. At the same time, we've also recognised that what one might call efficiency savings have a limited life, and what needs to be done in terms of sustainable service is transformation and changing business models, and that is a longer term project. It requires looking at outcomes, working with communities, working with partners, all those things. And that timescale does require medium and long-term planning. We've now nearly got all councils with medium-term plans. Something like just under half of them have long-term plans, and a third of them have scenario planning, and we need to push that forward. And undoubtedly, that is a significant challenge, and anything that can be done to assist councils in that regard, for example, a 3-year look ahead from government would reduce the risk that councils incur in having to make medium and long-term plans. So that would certainly be welcomed. But the need for medium and long-term planning is because you need to change business models. It's not promoting good practice. It's just necessary to make the thing work.
So you're indicating there that councils have been forced into some of these planning scenarios because they have had to accommodate these savings. And we know across the board that many councils have lost hundreds, if not thousands, of employees to try and manage that situation, because sometimes the biggest cost within a council is the wage bill. So when you talk about doing more with less, it's less people, and sometimes it's less money that you've got to have. So when we are talking about the efficiency savings, some people have also said that maybe it should have been more focused on the transformation strategy than the efficiency service. So it'd be quite good to see what your views are on that topic.
Maybe if I could lead off with that, Chairman. I think all councils at the moment, as far as we're aware, have got transformation programmes in place. And we're looking right across the range of services that we deliver to try to improve outcomes for local communities. That's what we're all about, and we're having to do that against a backdrop of a very tight financial environment. I think the reality behind council budgets is that a greater percentage as we go forward of spend is being consumed by the priority services of education and social care. And it's the other services, therefore, the quality of life services that people see around roads and refuse collection and parks, etc., that are starting to take quite a lot of pain. And what we're seeing here, what we're really saying, I think, is that there is limited capacity for us not to invest in roads, for us not to, not to cut the grass, and there's limited things that we can do around areas like recycling, where we're all pushing improvements in the recycling rate. So we're all investing in transformation. We're all recognising that transformation of services takes time. Long-term financial planning is absolutely essential, and I think the key message from councils would be a long-term approach to funding local authorities from the Scottish Government would be hugely valuable in assisting us with that process. Because,
as you indicate, unsustainable going forward. So the system is cracking up and falling apart to some extent, and you're trying to manage that collectively and being responsible about what you're managing across the piece. But unless there is a dramatic change, unless there's a fundamental move to something different, then we are going to see continual withdrawal and removal of services that were normally a council's involvement. And also the third sector have an input in all of this as well, because they have taken on some of the burden that councils have had to relinquish in this process. So I think that you give us a clear picture of where you are, and you're also trying to manage that process effectively and efficiently. But at the same time, there is still the need to develop a better strategy, and all councils have some kind of reserve or some kind of fund that they keep for a rainy day. Well, it would appear that we're not in that situation. We've got a howling gale or a situation that we find ourselves in at present time. So in reality, what is the next step? What do you see as the responsibility of your organisations to ensure that this organisation, i.e. the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament, have an input to make sure that things get better?
I think in reality, what we do need is better forward planning, longer term budgets, greater collaboration with government over what policies they want to bring forward, and much greater discussion early doors as to how we can deliver that, because we have got into a cycle now of sort of initiative-led budgets, so pockets of money will come forward for 1 year or 2 year sort of short-term initiatives, which may or may not have value at the time. We can argue about that another day, but that hampers our ability for longer term planning, because we're continually just trying to sort of tread water almost, and we're not able to actually think forward and plan into the longer term. So I think initiative-led budgets are problematic. They're great as a sticking plaster at that particular moment in time, but they don't give us the longevity for a longer term service. So that remodelling of services within councils, which is going to be essential going forward, has to be done much more in collaboration with government and much more discussion early doors as to long-term sustainability and value outcomes of projects that come forward.
Do you see 32 local authorities managing to survive?
I would hope so, yes, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
Swiftly moving on. Andy.
Thanks very much, Convener. A few points. Excuse me. I notice in COSLA's submission at paragraph 29, where you say the committee may also wish to note that the Scottish Government has set out their intention to decouple revenue from capital budgets in the event of a 3-year local government settlement. Can you say something more about when that decision was made and why?
Vicky, do you want to?
Yes, that was as part of the medium-term financial strategy, when at a time we were maybe potentially, we still don't know what's happening, going to get 3-year budgets. We were advised that there was a potential to get 3-year revenue budgets, but because of the Infrastructure Commission not reporting until the summer, there wouldn't be any further information on capital budgets until that point. I think the concern that local governments raised is, as said out in that paragraph, is we don't operate just a siloed revenue budget and a siloed capital budget. They are very much linked. Even any programme might have some capital investment, but actually a lot of the capital investment also comes from revenue side of the budget as well. And there's implications for both. So decoupling that was a concern. We might be in just another one-year budget anyway, so we don't know. But I think what we're saying is if we're having long-term budgets, which is would be helpful, which we've just talked about, it would be the revenue and capital together.
Okay, because in last year's budget, my party reached an agreement with the government, and I have the agreement here, that there would be a 3-year funding settlement for local government along with a supporting rules-based framework. So that's the agreement we have. If that agreement is going to be breached, then that has big implications for the forthcoming budget, because we expect agreements to be delivered. So I would welcome further. I mean, the decoupling has been announced there for the medium-term financial strategy. It's not been directly communicated to you by letter or anything like that.
Not by letter or anything, no.
Okay. Mr. Sharp, the Audit Scotland produced a report back in October last year saying that the NHS was not financially sustainable. What's your view as to the financial sustainability of local government?
Well, I think I've already commented on that, and our more detailed comments are set out in our reports. It needs a change in the way things are done. You can't just keep doing things the way they were before and look at efficiency savings. That isn't going to work. And there is scope to do that. We believe that the differences between councils aren't all explained by contextual differences. So we see that as we do carry out work in individual councils, that there is scope to improve, and clearly that there is also scope to improve using new technologies and new techniques. And I know councils are pursuing all these. What we haven't said and wouldn't say is that by doing all those things, you necessarily bridge the future projected gaps between demand and resource, although obviously it goes some way to do that and to improve outcomes. So I think at the moment we're in a position where councils have performed well in the circumstances they have, but they do need to change their ways of working in the future, and we'll keep that under review. I don't think we're in the position that is necessarily reflected in the NHS, and I mean, it's not my area and I wouldn't comment on it, but commentators have, for example, projected that over half the total government spend will be going to the NHS based on existing business models in the foreseeable future. And one can project that sort of thing and say, well, you just can't keep going on like that. We're not in that position in local government, but it is very challenging. So I wouldn't be saying it's not sustainable, but we are in a position where there does need to be significant change going forward.
Okay, and we've already talked about IJBs, and the projections for the NHS are worrying, certainly. But one of the policy responses to that has been to do much more preventative spend. The theory is that if people are healthier, we'll reduce spending on NHS. How much work's being done to try and make preventative spending work when often you're dealing with a number of different public agencies, which, as I think Mr. Sharp, you pointed out earlier, have got different ways of budgeting, different accountability rules, so that if a local authority, for example, or the police service come forward with an innovative way of doing something that costs $500,000 and it saves other public authorities and perhaps even saves the private sector as well, an equivalent sum of money, how do we actually make the accounting for that work so that the public authorities and local authorities are key to this, have the incentive to begin to do things differently when actually the financial benefit may accrue to other organisations?
So, as an accountant, I would say to you that sometimes accounting gets in the way. And I think we need to, as public authorities, look at the big picture and where we need to be investing in preventative spend. A recent very good example in the Borders is we're now funding 2 community action teams for the police directly from the council budget, because we recognise the impact that that can have in terms of quality of life in local communities. And these people are dealing with antisocial behaviour, parking offences, littering, dogfiling, all these kind of issues that make have an impact in terms of community quality of life. The council could have stood back and said, actually, that policing's not our problem, but we've taken the view that it's so important we invest jointly in these services that the council has agreed to fund that at the cost now of around £500,000 a year. And that type of thinking, looking across organisational boundaries and not letting the accounting get in the way of these things, I think is really quite important.
But you're saying that accounting does get in the way in...
I think the reality behind the structures that we have across the public services is that accounting does tend to get in the way of these things, yes, because we all want to know exactly what this cost and whose budget that came from. And what we need to maybe do is to look more across the public sector at where initiatives can make a genuine impact.
So we need a big integrated joint board?
Some big thinking, yeah.
By this, would you like to come in at this stage?
First of all, I think councils do very much recognise they have to work in partnership with other bodies to achieve outcomes. So where you're talking about initiatives within a council area, I think things like working with police or working with other bodies can work well, and the strict accounting of who's precisely paying for what doesn't necessarily stop an initiative that works for everyone working. I think when you upscale it and you look at something like joint boards, where you're talking about major amounts of money and major investment, then if the reporting structures and effectively the incentives for the different bodies are quite different, and the budget rules for the bodies are quite different, that can get quite become quite a challenge if you want to take money from one place to spend it somewhere else. And there will be an overall benefit, but there might be a time lag in seeing that benefit, and how do you actually capture all that and put it in a business case in two quite different structures. I think that's a different situation from the smaller situation, which can be handled within council areas or 2 council areas or something like that.
Okay, just a couple more questions. First of all, Mr Sharp, you talked about councils doing medium and long-term budgeting, and some are doing, I think you said a third, are doing scenario planning. It's always intrigued me what is this based on? I mean, I presume I'm looking to the finance people working at the coalface. I presume this is based on Scottish Fiscal Commission forecasts, private forecasts, Fraser-Vallender, medium-term financial forecasts, that kind of NRS, population forecasts, etc. Is that broadly correct?
All of those sources and many more. Our job as the Chief Finance Officers of councils is to advise their own councils of what the landscape looks like, both for the coming year and for years to come. Clearly, the difficulty is the lack of certainty of the many components that feed into the very complex financial picture that councils have to paint and then deal with. Government grant we have talked about, I mean, it's about 80% of the funding for revenue services in any given local authority. Knowing that for only 1 year is problematic. So on all our submissions, we have expressed a strong desire for longer term grant information from Scottish Government. Even if it's just provisional, we do recognise the uncertainty that the Scottish Government operates in as well, and the UK Government for that matter. So there's no absolute certainty here in the public finances, but even knowing provisional picture is better than not knowing anything. That said, we have to stick together all the assumptions. We don't know what pay awards are going to be other than the current negotiation settlement that we have. So it's a very complex picture. So we do look at a very, very wide range of sources, and you're kind of trying to read the runes of what all of these pieces of information are trying to tell you. As Graham has outlined, many councils have set out 5, even 10-year outlooks. We've done a 10-year outlook in my own council, and I do acknowledge that many of those assumptions as you get beyond year 1, 2, 3 become a bit wet finger in the air. However, it's something that if you can constantly update that, you can have a fair idea of what's coming over the horizon, which is better than no idea, I have to say. But it's a wide range of information that we draw upon, and we have discussions with Scottish Government, formal and informal, on a regular basis as well.
Okay, and finally, I just want to look at or ask you about whether councils have enough ability to raise income locally. I think one of the responses, sorry, I can't remember which one, talks about the new, transient visitor levies and things as not a panacea. They'll take some time, and they're quite modest in the bigger scheme of things. Your council tax is capped, and you don't set non-domestic rates. So do you have actually enough autonomy to be able to respond, perhaps, to the challenges that emerge in years 2 and 3 when you find you have shortfalls?
There are a wide range of powers available to local authorities. I think the issue is that some of them are constrained in a fairly significant way, and I don't just mean on the revenue raising side. So we've had a lot of discussion about the transient visitor tax, and I think nationally we're not quite there with it yet. There's obviously a lot of range of views been expressed there, and not all councils would be able to benefit from it. In any case, it would make probably an insignificant difference to some council areas. It's not, it's certainly not a panacea to balancing budgets. It will be a part of the picture, but if councils have less constraint on the ability to raise revenues, that would help. If councils have greater freedom to raise or reduce council tax, that would help. If there were less restraints on our spending decisions, such as the ability to drive efficiency or transformation in the education sector, rather than the focus on teacher numbers, that would help. There are a number of powers that are there but are not fully available to councils at the moment, so that would be certainly a plea to the committee and to the Parliament and the government to make some of those powers more available, and there will be other revenue raising powers that I'm sure councils could take advantage of and implement. So it's a picture both in terms of the revenue side and in terms of the spending side, that if greater freedoms were available, it would make the balance in our budgets and just become more tenable.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Annabelle?
Thank you. Good morning, panel. I think we've been having a very interesting discussion and picking up perhaps some of the issues and developing them forward, or at least thinking about how things could look further down the line. So I take what you say about 2 to 3 years, but let's go a wee bit further into the future. And I mean, a number of issues arise. So, for example, mention has been made of the fact that priority services, education, social care take up the lion's share of the budget. So do any of the panel members foresee a time where, in fact, say, for example, education is not provided in the way that it currently is, and central government takes a greater role? Is that something that has in forward planning? So when you forward plan to look at 10 years, 20 years, what do you foresee in terms of service provision? Do you see the status quo? Do you see something different? Anybody want to give that a go?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. I think in this current political climate, it's very difficult for any of us to predict on any long term. I would hope and I would anticipate that education would always sit at the heart of local communities, and I think the best people to deliver education within their communities are local communities. So I wouldn't like to see too much more centralised sort of government intervention within what should be delivered at local level. But there are challenges, and I think councils, again, have dealt with those historically over the past few years. We've seen savings in schools. Education budgets have not been immune to savings, but that's been at a fairly manageable level. We've seen some schools that are now only operating 4.5 days a week, whereas previously and historically there were 5. I think what we have to do, though, is look at what do children need through their education, what do pupils need within their education. That is actually the key factor. So as I said before, we need to look at what outcomes are we trying to achieve and what is the best start for those pupils in schools and how is the best way to deliver that. And I think councils will continue to do that. But there's no question going forward that education and social care will remain at the top of any agenda. Of course they will, they absolutely will. So how we manage that will be probably with more collaboration with government, but I would hope not too much more intervention.
If I can comment, I won't comment on the policy aspects because we take the sort of policies as fixed, but I may perhaps just make a couple of observations about outcomes. And if I think about schools and education, it does integrate with other things that are happening in areas concerning outcomes. For example, we produced a report on young people's mental health last year and how schools function within the area and the social care in the area and the facilities for supporting mental health is really important. So anything that changed in schools would have to be able to maintain how it integrated with that. And going the other way round, we'll be producing an education report next year. But I think what is clear is that educational outcomes aren't just dependent on number of teachers and the number of school buildings. There are other environmental factors that are important, sort of deprivation, the economic activity, the cultural environment in which the young people grow up, which are local. So that also contributes to outcomes. So without commenting on whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, how education structured, I just note those crossovers when one's looking at outcomes.
Ms Ewing, I think all she was doing was giving an example of something that might have changed. Yeah. She wasn't suggesting it.
No, I'm not suggesting. I'm just floating it out there. Because I think, you know, as the convener had referred to earlier, you know, we can have, you know, could spend the whole time in this debate about core ring-fenced, the fact that there has been an uplift of 2.9% from the Scottish Government in year 2019-20 in real terms, etc. But, you know, to widen out the discussion, including looking further into the future, picking up on a point that Alexander Stewart referenced, again, I'm not saying this was his political position, he's now looking at me anxiously, but the issue of the number of local authorities. So Councillor McGregor had, you know, been very bullish, saying absolutely in the future there will be 32 local authorities. Does the panel feel that, say, 10, 20 years hence, that 32 local authorities for a country of 5.4 million people at this point is the best use of the public purse?
Politician at the table, so it's probably incumbent on me to answer that. I think that we've had, in the 12.5 years that I've been a councillor, we've seen a lot of centralisation, and prior to my days, you know, we had district councils and things were truly delivered locally. And I still maintain that while we do need some overarching national policies and statutory function, which we all adhere to, local people deliver best, and I think we actually sometimes create best value for money. What we need to do as councils is work along in partnership with other councils, potentially better, and I think with digital technology that will enable us to do that as well. But I still think that local services are local. And local councils and local government is local. And if we continue to centralise that, we get further and further and further away from the people that we're actually trying to assist locally. That's the politician's answer.
Whereas I won't necessarily comment on the need for 32 councils or not, there's no doubt that greater sharing of service provision across councils, but also across partners in other parts of the public and potentially private sector, I think is inevitable. We've spent quite a bit of time talking about the health and social care partnerships, and I won't reopen all of that other than to say that it is difficult. It has been difficult, and that has been about historic delivery structures being opened up, and it's in positions that are historical positions starting to break down, but it is difficult to, for example, accept the losing the identity of funding, for example, that is difficult. That's been a difficult one to crack and has not been cracked yet. And I think if we have shared services across local government, equally there will be brave decisions that will need to be taken in order to deliver that. I mean, some of the decisions around the integration joint board and the partnerships will be about improved outcomes that won't necessarily become apparent for years down the line. So it's about taking these brave decisions now. If it's about shared delivery of services across councils or other partners, that's about letting go control, frankly, and having service provision, whether that be back office or front line, shared with other partners in the public sector. And again, that will present challenges in terms of control, in terms of where employment opportunities sit. But I think it's inevitable, given the picture that hopefully we've tried to give the committee, that the local government finances, whereas they're not at the point of being unsustainable, they are under extreme pressure. And one of the ways of cracking that particular nut will be to have greater sharing of service provision across the 32 councils. And I think the way you've framed it is actually quite appropriate, that we are a smallish nation. We have 32 councils. Can we have 32 levels of service provision for each and every service that we deliver? Probably not.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. And I was going to get on to the very important issue of cross-working. And I mean, you know, just going back a moment to Councillor McGregor's point, I mean, obviously, you know, again, it's just making the point that has been made in many quarters over many years now. But when you look at the 32 local authorities, you're also looking at a considerable duplication of senior posts, and that is at a cost. So that is reducing budget otherwise available. And Mr Boyle's point about trying to look at perhaps the service, and you can't expect for each and individual service going forward, given financial challenges, that to be provided on the 32 local authority traditional model. But I suppose, how do we get to a better place then? How do we drive forward this cross-working? I mean, we have seen with IGBs, as has been discussed this morning, that some are going very well and some are not going very well at all. So how do we drive forward that cross-working, certainly cross local authority boundary working, and indeed wider cross public sector working? How do we can talk about it all we like? How do we actually make that happen? What kind of things do you foresee being required to make that happen?
I think you make some incredibly good points, and I think it gives us all much food for thought, and I think we do think about it anyway. As I say, I think localisation is key, but it's working alongside all of our third sector partners, all the charity sector, the voluntary sector, multi-agencies. I think councils have been very good at transforming and reshaping departments. But as you say, that's only senior officers at the top level. That's not what you deliver through your, to outcomes. So I think we will have to continue to work, I think, as Graham summarised earlier on, perhaps less silo, be a little bit less protective of our accounts, and a little bit more collaborative. I think we need to accept that there has been duplication in some of our communities. You know, we may be delivering something at council level and then through an audit find that a third sector organisation has also been doing that. And I think this is another piece of work that we're doing through COSLA, is looking at historic ring fencing or initiatives that were put in place maybe 10, 12, 15 years ago, again, had great value at the time and have continued to sit there whilst other things have been created over here. So I think it's looking at what we do well, acknowledging that locally we can make really good decisions because we understand our demographic and we know that the centre of Glasgow is going to be completely different from Newton Stewart, and I think that's incredibly important. Looking at what we do well, but auditing where we can do better and utilising the skills and the other agencies that we have in the area to help us to deliver more collaboratively. And as you say, not working silos. We've all been guilty of that in the past, every agency. And I think it's really important that we open our doors.
Ms Bibby, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, I think there's general consensus that place-based approaches are will go a long way to improve outcomes. And in answer to your question, I think leadership is a key part of that. And COSLA is working with the Scottish Government and all the organisations as part of the Senior Leadership Forum to have explicitly those discussions. How do we create capacity around that place-based transformation? So those discussions are happening, and it's having the leadership push behind that, which will hopefully see further trickle down of actually place all the sectors coming together on that issue.
Okay, well, that's positive, but obviously time does march on. I take it therefore, a question for Mr Sharp briefly, the last question, that would require a slightly different approach on the part of the Accounts Commission if there were much greater sharing of service provision, delivery. How would the Accounts Commission then adapt to that new world?
Well, if it's within councils, it would still fall completely within our powers. So it wouldn't necessarily raise an issue. We might have to think about exactly how we covered that in different reports. But we already have the issue of councils working in partnership outside councils themselves to deliver services, and how do we deal with that? And the way we have dealt with that up till now is that when we look at best value reports, we actually look at things that are strictly outside the council's ambit. If you just took the powers as a sort of barrier, you couldn't go through it. We actually look at what's happening. It could get to a point where one would want to look at it and say, well, actually, to do this properly, it would be helpful if we could do more. That's something that might happen in future. And the other thing that we do, and we're doing more, and we talk about it in the Strategic Scrutiny Group, which is the group of all the scrutiny bodies that deal with local government, and I chair that for the Accounts Commission, is working together where they might have a wider scope and look at aspects of a service that we don't, that goes outside the council. So there are things we do at the moment to look wider than just the limits of what the council does, to embrace partnership working, and at the moment that's adequate. But as I say, depending how the future develops, that's something one might need to look at.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Kenny, do you want to comment on this point?
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, panel. And I always find discussions such as the one we've just had quite frustrating. I was a councillor in the 90s when we had the last reorganisation, 53 local authorities, or district authorities, 9 regions and 3 island authorities moved. It became 32. Some of them, of course, should not have existed, but were created for purely political reasons. And I would have thought that the way forward, for example, in Ayrshire would be to merge the 3 local authorities into one, along with the Health Board, which could be responsible for health, social work, education, economic development, transport, with devolution of powers down to borough councils to deal with everything from potholes to libraries, local planning, etc. But I dare say I'll be stymied on that for another few years, because I don't think there's much appetite for local government restructuring. So what do we do with the system we've got just now? Well, first of all, I think we have to find out what the ask is, because if we look at actually the current financial context in terms of both the papers that have been presented by COSLA and SEIPFA, both have used the SPICE graph, which shows that in the 5 years to 2019, Scotland's revenue budget was cut by £1 billion, some 3% in real terms. However, local government suffered a significantly larger decrease of over 7%. So what SPICE have said in paragraph 12 is that local government share has fallen from 34.8% to just 33%. But there doesn't seem to be any argument made that I've been able to read through the documents whether or not the view is that that should be reversed, whether that figure should be held at 33%, ring-fenced at 33%, to use a phrase that's already been used, or how we actually close the funding gap, which is clearly developing. In paragraph 54, for example, the model, it says the model for in the COSLA paper, Convener, it says the model forecasts increasing demand on local services of 1.988 billion, or 17.3% by 2022-23. That's an astronomical sum. I don't think anybody in this room thinks that's remotely achievable financially. And just before I let the panel in, convener, the problem is that there's a squeeze from two directions. I've just mentioned the bill being cut in real terms for UK government, but also NHS is squeezing. Mr Sharp talked about 50% over the next few years. It's under devolution. The NHS share has grown from 36 to 43%. So how can we possibly give local government the money I certainly feel, and I think most of us feel, it deserves, without either taxing everybody to death or taking money from other really important areas of the Scottish budget? That's the difficulty. We get papers here which are really well written and well developed that talk about the need for additional funding, but they're not really, they're kind of lacking in where the funding should come from. So I'd just like the panel to advise how we can square that circle. We'll bite the bullet first, Mr Boyle.
Okay, so we do recognise that we operate in a world where a lot of these decisions will be taken as political or policy priorities. So we are not in any of our submissions saying that the government putting funding into one sector or another is a good or a bad thing. These are policy decisions that are taken nationally, but they do have an impact on local government. And I think what we're trying to take out, rather than go into percentages and numbers, what we're trying to get out in terms of the essence of the submissions is that we cannot continue to deliver the same local government services that we currently deliver with the funding that is there. And that is, I think, hopefully the key message we want to kind of bring out of both of the submissions, actually. So the question would be, do we wish to continue to deliver the same services, or do we wish to pay more in terms of fiscal contribution into that through taxation? Again, these are political decisions, but there will be things that local government can do through its lobbying, through its implementation of the current powers that it has. We clearly have a review of the current system of council tax coming up that we would obviously wish to contribute into that debate. But again, the basic ask there would be to have whatever that ends up as, if there's a significant reduction in funding for local government through whatever solution is ultimately achieved, that would have serious consequences for local government. So we're trying to paint a picture here that the current funding model cannot deliver the services we currently produce going forward. If only for the demographic challenge in social care, clearly that is going to have a massive impact on funding of services. So there is a question about taxation. That's one for national politicians to have a look at. But having that debate, that honest debate about, can we deliver the same services with the current fiscal model? I don't think we can. And that's really about us, again, taking brave decisions about changes to what the public expectations of our current service delivery are, local governments and national government politicians' expectations. Currently, it doesn't stack up in terms of what's deliverable in coming years, and that's the key message we're trying to get out here. So taxation may be part of the solution, but that's I'm not going to make any recommendations about that. It's one for politicians to consider.
We're actually looking for recommendations. We're looking for answers, because I think we have all the questions, but we're really looking for you to say, this is what we think you should do. This is how much we think you should. I mean, we've seen that figure, which I think is very helpful. I mean, I think it's a big figure, but at least a figure has been put into the COSLA document. I think we're looking to see, well, look, this is what we think you need to spend. This is how we think you should change services to deliver what can be delivered, and this is where we think the money should come from, whether it's other Scottish budgets or it's additional tax. If it's additional taxation, how much? Should income tax go 1%, 2%? Should it be higher rate taxpayers? Should the threshold change? I mean, these are things. It's one thing just saying. I always find it frustrating when people come and say we need additional money, and we all agree that local government needs additional money. What we're looking for is where that money should come from, as well as how much is required and what it should be spent on. Sorry.
I was just going to make a sort of observation from which I think is consistent with all the reports we produced, although it's not a way we've presented it. If I just look at local government and look at that challenge, I think there are sort of three areas that local government would be looking at. One would be funding And clearly, as central government funding reduces, it has to look at other ways of obtaining income, whether it's fees or local taxes or rents, whatever. The second area is how it uses its resources, and that's the transformational change in looking at the scope of services, and fundamental to that is medium and long-term financial planning and indeed workforce planning and corporate planning. And I think the third area would be demand management, and that would be preventative spend. How do we actually reduce the demands on our services? And the other thing that is preventative, but it's much more than preventative, is economic development and increasing prosperity, because that both reduces demand in terms of reducing deprivation, and it also increases the tax base for funding. So I think from just a sort of strategic point of view, looking at local government, those would be the things I'd be thinking that policymakers would be considering.
Mr. Robertson, you wanted to comment?
I'm not going to comment on the size of the cake question, which I think is not one that we're going to solve today. But what I would like to offer is coming back to comments I made previously about us looking at health and social care as the one system, and recognising that we need to fund whatever the size of the cake, health and the care services in communities on the same basis. I do think one of the answers to this is around prevention, and I do think that one of the solutions to some of this is what we're actually spending as a nation on public health, because that sits at the heart of the prevention agenda. And if you look at what other countries like Finland have done, for example, they've had significant investment in public health campaigns around, alcohol and diet and heart disease and tobacco, all these kind of issues which ultimately bear very heavily upon the health service through treatment. So there is something in there about some of the answers to the challenges that we face. Whole systems approach to funding and learning from best practice elsewhere around public health, and a real focus on prevention in that space, because we spend a tiny fraction of the total health budget on public health prevention measures, and the majority on treatment and acute services. And if we could shift that over time, that's an area where we could gain significant benefits as a nation.
And I think just further to that, that's discussion that I'm having with my health and social care spokesperson, with both ministers within those portfolios, that there needs to, as I said right at the start of this evidence session, there needs to be a greater recognition of the contribution that councils make to overall health. So when we look at health consequentials coming through the Barnett formula, very little of that historically has been passed to local government, if any at all, until the last 18 months. And I think if we're very serious about the early intervention, the prevention agenda, and keeping people within their communities and keeping them healthy in their communities, some of that money needs to be recognised as having a value within local government to save the NHS in the long run as well. And I think one of the challenges that we have at the moment, talking about where does money come from, we're already looking at £481 million worth of additional commitments in next year's budget. Now, my fear is, where does that come from when Scottish Government is making the decision as to what to give us? At what expense is that going to come? So I think that we have some longer term decisions through health and social care and transfer of health consequentials that need to be implemented, and implemented quite quickly. But we also have the very start in the next 4 months. Mr Mackay is going to set his budget, and he has to find an additional 481 million before we've even got off the starting blocks. And where will that come from? It needs to be additional. These are really important things that they're funding, but it can't be at the expense of what we're already doing, unless you can tell us what you think we should be cutting.
I suppose that's you asking Kenny the questions he's already asked you about where the money comes from.
I don't think. Well, I mean, I have to say, Convener, I'm pretty underwhelmed, because by the responses, because I think if people are coming here asking for additional resources for the specific areas of the budget, it's helpful to us if we're preparing a report for Scottish ministers to recommend. It's funny that they say, well, we think local government should get X a million more, and that money should come from A, B, C, D in the Scottish Government. I mean, I just don't think it's helpful to come and not provide any of that information. I mean, I'm chair of the joint chair of the cross-party group on Scotland's Health 2021 beyond, so I'm well aware, given that committee deals with tobacco, alcohol and obesity, about these challenges, but that's not going to happen. These are only going to be solved in the next 4 or 5 months. We're looking for conveyances for the budget as we're going forward now, and that would be helpful. But I'll move on, if I can, for just one other thing, Convener, and that's about ring fencing. And the CICFA report actually says, and I quote, "The current position where councils cannot reduce the number of teachers that they employ, even where efficiencies and the cost of service are possible without compromising the standard of service, is placing a particular strain on council budgets." Now, under the historic Concordat in 2007, ring fencing under the previous Lablab administration was effectively abolished. But the reason it's kind of crept in is because when local government is given additional money, for example, for teacher numbers, and they decide to spend it on something else, it's Scottish ministers have to stand up in the chamber and get attacked by politicians whose own parties are the ones that are reducing teacher numbers because there are fewer teachers in Scotland. So how are ministers supposed to address that issue? Say they allow local authorities to say, OK, fair enough, we'll remove ring fencing on teacher numbers, and some local authorities say, well, we don't really need as many teachers because we've only got 5 doing higher biology in this school and 6 in that school. We can maybe have 1 teacher covering both. But how then do we avoid the issue of, the political parties that take their decisions, own colleagues, then attacking the government effectively because there's fewer teachers in Scotland? I mean, this is the practicality. This is a real politic of all this. It's not just a zero about facts and figures. It's about how this is presented, and from a ministerial point of view, that's a very difficult position. Yes, Mr Boyle, it's on your paper.
There was another submission, so I'll lead on that. So when we put this evidence together, we tried to keep out of the politics of that. So what the points we're making in these submissions, we're doing on a basis of professional advice, so that the politics that surround that, we try not to get involved in. I think the point we're making in here is that the focus is purely on the inputs, which is the number of teachers, which represents about 20% of the cost base of local government. Now, clearly, any inability to influence that by councils has a major gearing impact on other services. So where there will be opportunities to structure and deliver services in a different way that may result in teacher numbers being reduced, that avenue is not open to councils at the moment. It has not been for the last 6 years. So that's really the point we're making. We're not trying to make a political point in this, and we appreciate there are political ramifications for any particular party in taking a position on that. However, there will be opportunities there, whether it be through delivering education using technology more smartly, whether it be sharing of resources between educational establishments, sharing of staff between establishments, etc. There will be many options that are open, but they simply cannot be delivered at the moment, and that's just the reality of it. So that's the point we're trying to make in this submission, and so it's really a plea maybe to focus more on the outputs rather than the inputs. I think what we have seen, part of the consequences of that restriction has been the reduction in other educational staff, such as classroom assistants, support for learning assistants, etc., who are not included within the teacher numbers. And very often they make as much a difference, particularly in some of our more vulnerable communities, than teachers do to the educational provision and the support that goes with that educational provision. So that's in essence the point we're trying to make, that we would like more freedom to be able to deliver solutions that would not result in a deterioration of the educational outcome, but can do it in a slightly different way.
If not,
well,
make it very short.
I could.
No more.
I think you see the frustration that government has. You know, the government goes into an election with a manifesto that they'll fully fund free personal care or teacher numbers, etc. Local authorities then reduce them. Then that government gets criticised, and it also gets criticised when it then says, "Well, hold on a minute, we'll actually tie additional funding in specifically to those numbers." So I think that's an issue we have to be honest and open about if we're actually going to get the situation whereby what Mr Boyle suggested, where it's outputs that count rather than inputs, predominates.
Sarah, you had a couple of quick points to this.
Very quick follow-up. There was a couple of points which, unlike Kenny, I felt very warm towards about preventative spend, public health spend, and there was a suggestion that there are short-term and long-term benefits, but to tie the issue into actual outputs, and you can give us it afterwards, what actual sums have you done on short-term benefits that are financial benefits that deliver output changes, and what have you done in terms of long term? Because we all talk warmly about preventative spend, but don't actually do it. And you've made the point that 3 to 4 years in, the IJBs are not delivering on it. So it's really, what evidence have you got that actually helps raise that up the agenda or demonstrates practically what you could do that was better than what we're doing at the moment? And it can be additional evidence if you'd prefer to do it that way.
I think we could provide some specific examples around that might help. So, one specific thing that we've done in Scottish Borders is to develop a new discharge to assess unit, which gets people out of hospital faster. So there's not delayed discharge in the local general hospital, and we think that's made a significant difference to statistics in that area. Has got people moved on from hospital stays faster where they don't need to be there. So that's a good example of prevention, which we feel has had a short-term impact and will give longer-term benefit. But we can come back to you with more specific examples from COSLA on that, I'm sure.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So you'll just send that to the committee then. Okay, in that case, can I just thank the panel very much for that? That was a very, very useful session. Thank you very much, and we will now that concludes the public part of today's meeting. Thank you. Right. We move the session into private.